The CEO had one rule for his building: no pets. His new neighbor arrived with a pig, wearing his favorite tie. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what's the most unusual pet you've ever seen someone have? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy! Preston Windsor believed in order. It wasn't merely a preference, it was the foundational principle upon which he had built his entire existence. His company, Windsor Holdings, ran on algorithms of ruthless efficiency. His penthouse apartment, a symphony of charcoal gray, polished chrome and glass, was so meticulously organized that a misplaced coaster constituted a major crisis. And his building, the Windsor Grand, a sleek monolith of steel piercing the city skyline, operated under one sacrosanct non-negotiable commandment. Rule 1, Section 1, Clause A of the Residency Agreement. No animals. Not a parakeet, not a goldfish, not a hypoallergenic teacup-sized fluff ball that could fit inside a designer handbag. He'd personally overseen the eviction of a socialite who'd tried to smuggle in a chihuahua named Fifi 4, arguing it was an emotional support accessory. Preston had calmly informed her that while he supported emotional stability, he did not support shedding, barking, or anything that could potentially relieve itself on the imported Italian marble in the lobby. His aversion wasn't born of cruelty, but of trauma. He could still vividly recall the day his father's prize-winning architectural model, a project destined for international acclaim, had been reduced to a pile of chewed balsa wood and plastic splinters by the family's overeager golden retriever, Montgomery. That day, a 10-year-old Preston had learned a valuable lesson. Chaos, in its furriest form, was the enemy of progress. This morning, however, the primary disruption to his orderly world wasn't a canine interloper. It was a sartorial one. He stood before the automated tie rack in his cavernous walk-in closet, a frown creasing his brow. His thumb pressed the button again, and the rack whirred obediently, presenting its silk and cashmere offerings. Dozens of ties, each a masterpiece of tailoring, glided past. But the one he wanted, the one he needed, was gone. It was his favorite. A custom-made silk tie in a specific shade of deep, commanding blue, a color he privately called Windsor blue. It was woven with subtle silver threads that caught the light just so, a gift from his late grandfather. A man who understood that power wasn't just about what you said, but how you presented yourself. He wore it to close every major deal. It was his armor, and it was missing. He'd already called his personal assistant, who confirmed it wasn't at the office. He'd mentally retraced his steps from the previous week. It was last worn to the Sterling Gala, after which it was sent out for its customary special cleaning. That was it. It must still be at the cleaners. A minor annoyance, but an annoyance nonetheless. He settled for a lesser charcoal gray tie, feeling vaguely incomplete, like a general heading into battle without his lucky sword. He spent the day in a state of controlled irritation. A billion-dollar merger was on the line, and while the negotiations went smoothly, he felt off-kilter without his talisman. He returned to the Windsor Grand at precisely 6 p.m., the silence of the private elevator a balm to his frayed nerves. As the doors whispered open directly into his penthouse foyer, he anticipated an evening of quiet contemplation, a glass of scotch, and the soothing logic of the stock market ticker. What he got, instead, was a squeal. It wasn't a human sound. It was high-pitched, indignant, and distinctly agricultural. Preston froze, his hand halfway to loosening his inferior tie. He tilted his head, listening. There it was again, followed by a frantic scrambling noise and a woman's voice, cooing, Now, Hamlet, be a gentleman, we're almost home." Hamlet? Preston's mind raced through the tenant directory. There was no one named Hamlet, and that sound, it was utterly alien to this sterile, controlled environment. His building was a fortress of tranquility. This was a breach. He strode to his front door, his jaw set. The sound was coming from the hallway, near the service elevators. He pulled the heavy door open and stepped out. The scene that greeted him was so profoundly bizarre, so completely incongruous with the reality of the Windsor Grand, that for a full 3 seconds, his brain refused to process it. There, wrestling with a teetering stack of cardboard boxes on a luggage cart, was a woman. She had a cascade of unruly honey-blonde hair escaping a messy bun, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and the most determined blue eyes he'd ever seen. She wore faded jeans and a t-shirt that said "Stay Oinky." And beside her, attached to a bright red harness, was a pig. Not a tiny teacup piglet. A proper pot-bellied pig, pink and plump, with intelligent, beady eyes that regarded Preston with an unnerving level of appraisal. The pig was, to Preston's horror, snuffling at the base of a priceless abstract sculpture he'd installed in the hallway. But that wasn't the worst of it. Oh no. The worst part, the part that made the world tilt on its axis, was the item tied jauntily around the pig's thick neck. It was a silk tie. A silk tie in a specific shade of deep, commanding, Windsor blue, woven with subtle silver threads that caught the light of the hallway sconces. His tie. His grandfather's tie. His armor. Time seemed to slow down. The squeal in his ears was now his own internal scream of rage. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice emerging as a low, dangerous purr. "Excuse me." The woman, Laura Kelly, looked up, startled. She blew a stray strand of hair out of her face. "Oh, hi. Sorry. Are we in your way? This cart has a mind of its own. I think one of the wheels is plotting against me." Preston ignored the cart. He ignored her flustered, disarming smile. He pointed a single, trembling finger at the pig. "What?" he said, each word a chip of ice. "Is that?" Laura's eyes followed his finger. She beamed, a wave of affection transforming her face. "Oh, this is Hamlet. Isn't he a dreamboat? He's a bit nervous about the move, but he's adjusting wonderfully. He loves the elevator." "Hamlet," Preston repeated, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "You have brought a farm animal into my building." Her smile faltered slightly. "He's not a farm animal. He's a registered emotional support pig. He's cleaner than most people, I assure you, and he's fully house-trained." To prove her point, Hamlet let out a contented snort. Preston's gaze narrowed, moving from the pig's snout to the silk abomination around its neck. "And his neckwear," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Where did you acquire it?" Laura looked down at the tie, her expression shifting to one of mild confusion, as if noticing it for the first time. "Oh, it's his formal wear. He likes to look dapper for special occasions, like moving into a fancy new home." "That is a one-of-a-kind, custom-made tie," Preston stated, his patience evaporating. "And it belongs to me. I'm going to ask you one more time, where did you get it?" Laura's defensiveness flared. She placed a protective hand on Hamlet's back. "Look, mister, I don't know who you are, but you can't just accuse my pig of being a tie thief. It was a mix-up, okay? A case of mistaken identity, of the laundry variety. Things get lost, things get found. It's perfectly clean, I promise. Hamlet has very high standards." The laundry variety. The phrase snagged in Preston's analytical mind, but the sheer audacity of the situation overpowered his logic. "Mistaken identity? Your pig has an identity that requires bespoke silk neckwear. He has a certain panache," she retorted, nudging a box with her foot, "and a fondness for the name Windsor. I saw it on the little tag. He just seemed drawn to it, you know? Like it was destiny." The tag, of course. His ties were labeled. P. Windsor. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of such profound incompetence that it made his head spin. He remembered his assistant mentioning she'd sent the tie to a new place, a place highly recommended for delicate fabrics. What was it called? As if reading his mind, Laura grumbled, mostly to herself. "This day has been a disaster. First, the moving van is late, then Hamlet has a meltdown, and now I think I left my favorite cardigan back at Elite Fabric Care on 5th Avenue during the whole receipt fiasco." Elite Fabric Care. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. That was it. That was the cleaner. A wave of cold fury washed over Preston. Some minimum-wage employee had clearly mixed up his priceless heirloom with this woman's laundry. And she had, with a level of carelessness that beggared belief, tied it around her pig's neck. But the logistical explanation did nothing to quell the primary issue. "I am Preston Windsor," he announced, the name landing in the air with the weight of a dropped anvil. "This is my building, and in my building, we have rules. Rule number 1, which you would have read had you bothered to look at the contract you signed, is no animals." Laura's jaw dropped. Her face paled. You're the owner?" "Oh my word. The rental agent. She said the penthouse owner was particular, but she never mentioned." "I am beyond particular," Preston cut her off. "I am absolute. The pig goes. Now." Laura drew herself up to her full height, which was still a good head shorter than him, The fear in her eyes was replaced by a steely resolve. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Hamlet is not a pig to be disposed of. He's my family. And according to city bylaws, service and support animals are protected. I have the paperwork." "I have the deed," Preston shot back, "and an army of lawyers who enjoy a good fight. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises, you and your dapper companion." He turned on his heel, the image of his favorite tie nestled in a pig's fleshy neck folds seared into his brain. He strode back to his penthouse, the heavy door clicking shut behind him with a sound of grim finality. Inside his silent, orderly sanctuary, Preston stood in the center of the living room, his hands clenched into fists. His world, once a bastion of predictable perfection, now had a pig-shaped Windsor blue tie-wearing hole blown through its center. Laura Kelly. She was chaos in human form. A walking, talking, pig-owning agent of disorder. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his mind racing. Elite fabric care. The mix-up was infuriating, but explainable. He would deal with them tomorrow, heads would roll. But the woman? Laura Kelly. He couldn't get her defiant blue eyes out of his head, or her ridiculous t-shirt, or the absurd, maddening, and utterly unacceptable fact that his lucky tie currently resided on a pig named Hamlet who lived one floor below him. The eviction notice would be drafted first thing in the morning. He would restore order. He had to. Because if he didn't, he had the terrifying suspicion that his perfectly structured world was about to be turned completely and oinkingly upside down. The silence of Preston Windsor's penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. Every polished surface seemed to gleam with judgment. Every minimalist piece of furniture stood as a silent testament to the order that had been so flagrantly violated. He paced the length of his floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights below a glittering, indifferent tapestry. One floor down, a pig was likely sleeping, perhaps even dreaming piggy dreams, in his fortress of solitude. And it was wearing his tie as pajamas. He stopped, pulling his phone from his pocket. There was only one course of action when faced with such an existential threat: overwhelming legal force. He speed-dialed his lawyer, Arthur Vance, a man whose hourly rate could fund a small nation, but was worth every penny for his shark-like efficiency. "Arthur," Preston began, dispensing with pleasantries, "we have a situation at the Grand. A hostile takeover? Corporate espionage?" Arthur's voice was smooth, accustomed to midnight emergencies. "Worse," Preston growled, "an infiltration of the porcine variety." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. "Come again, Preston? Did you say porcine? A pig?" "Arthur, there is a woman, a new tenant named Laura Kelly in apartment 34B, who has moved in with a pig, a pot-bellied pig named Hamlet." Another pause, this one longer. Preston could almost hear the gears turning in Arthur's expensive legal mind. "A pig," Arthur repeated slowly, as if testing the word's validity in a court of law. "Preston, are you certain? Perhaps it was a large, unusually pink bulldog." "It was snorting, Arthur. It was wearing my Windsor blue tie, and it responded to the name Hamlet. I am certain." The admission about the tie felt like swallowing glass. "Right," Arthur said, his tone shifting back to professional efficiency. "Emotional support animal, I presume? The paperwork is usually the first line of defense." "She claims it is. I informed her she had 24 hours to vacate. I want you to draft the official eviction notice. Cite Rule 1, Section 1, Clause A. Then cite the nuisance clause, the health code clause, and any other clause you can find. I want her buried in so much legal paper she can't find her way to the elevator." "Understood. I'll look into the city's specific ordinances regarding non-traditional support animals in residential high-rises. They can be tricky." "But Preston, about the tie." "We are not discussing the tie," Preston snapped, ending the call. He felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. The tie was a separate matter, a personal affront that law books couldn't rectify. That required direct action. But first, he had to deal with the primary contamination. His night was restless. His mind, usually a clean slate of data and projections, was filled with images of unruly blonde hair and the contented snort of a pig. He woke feeling as if he'd slept on a bed of nails. The morning brought a new assault. As he stood in his kitchen, waiting for his precisely calibrated espresso to brew, a faint, unfamiliar scent wafted up from somewhere. It was earthy, sweet, vaguely like baked apples and cedar chips. He sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling in disgust. It was the pig. He could smell the pig through the reinforced concrete and steel of his own floor. This was no longer a theoretical breach of contract. It was a sensory invasion. And then he heard it. A rhythmic thump, thump, thump from the floor below. It was steady, almost playful. What in the world was she doing down there? Teaching it to jog? That was the final straw. Legal proceedings took time. The smell and the noise were immediate, and his tie was still, presumably, a hostage. He showered, dressed in a suit of severe black, his war armor, and rode the elevator down one floor. He stood before the door to 34B, his knuckles raised to knock, when the door swung open on its own. Laura Kelly stood there, holding a bright green apple, looking just as chaotic as she had the night before. Today's t-shirt read, "Picture Perfect." "Oh," she said. "Mr. Windsor, I was just about to take Hamlet for his morning. Constitutional." She gestured vaguely. Preston's eyes swept past her into the apartment. It was a maelstrom of half-unpacked boxes, but not the den of filth he'd imagined. A wall was already filled with books, their spines a colorful, chaotic mosaic. A vintage record player sat on a crate, and a framed print of a ridiculously cheerful abstract painting leaned against the wall. It was messy, but it was a vibrant, lived-in mess. It was life. The thought was so unwelcome, he immediately quashed it. "Miss Kelly," he said, his voice a low hum of authority, "we need to talk about the fumes and the noise." "Fumes?" She took a deliberate sniff of the air. "You mean Hamlet's aromatherapy diffuser? It's a special blend to promote calm and positive energy. I could give you the name of the Etsy shop if you'd like." "I would not," he said through gritted teeth. "And the thumping?" "Oh, that's his favorite game. It's called Find the Treat. I roll his favorite ball. It's a special weighted one for hoof-eye coordination, and he nudges it back to me. It's excellent for his cognitive development." Preston stared at her, speechless. Hoof-eye coordination, cognitive development. She spoke about this creature as if it were a gifted child at a prestigious academy. "This is not a barn, Miss Kelly. It is a luxury residence. My residents expect silence and odor-free hallways." "Well, your hallway smells faintly of lemon-scented floor polish and quiet desperation, so I figured I was improving things." She shot back, her friendly demeanor hardening into a defensive shell. She took a protective step back, blocking his view of the apartment. "Look, I received an email from your lawyer this morning. A very enthusiastic email with a lot of attachments. I've already forwarded it to my contact at the Urban Animal Advocacy League. They're quite familiar with these situations." Of course she had a league. He should have known. "This will not end well for you," he warned. "Neither will this," she retorted, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of genuine humor in her eyes. "You're all tense. Your shoulders are practically touching your ears. You need to relax. Maybe I can loan you Hamlet for an afternoon." He's an excellent listener. The sheer nerve of her was almost impressive. Almost. "I am not here to borrow your pig, Miss Kelly. I am here to retrieve my property." He looked pointedly toward the interior of her apartment, where he could just see Hamlet trotting into view, the Windsor blue tie still around his neck like a garish trophy. Laura followed his gaze and sighed, a long, put-upon sound. "Right. The tie. I was going to wash it for you." "You will do no such thing." Preston commanded, horrified at the thought of his bespoke silk tie tumbling around in a machine with t-shirts that said, "Stay oinky." "You will give it to me, now?" "He's rather attached to it," she said thoughtfully. "He thinks it makes him look distinguished. You can't just snatch it from him. You'll hurt his feelings. He is a pig. He does not have feelings about haberdashery. You've clearly never met Hamlet." She held the door open wider. "Be my guest? You can try to negotiate with him yourself. He's a tough customer. But he can be reasoned with, usually for a price." Preston hesitated. Entering her apartment felt like crossing a line, like stepping into the heart of the chaos he so despised. But the sight of the tie, his tie, being used as a pig's fashion accessory, spurred him onward. He stepped across the threshold, and the smell of apples and cedar was stronger here, mingling with the scent of old books and fresh coffee. It wasn't entirely unpleasant. Hamlet was standing in the middle of the living room, regarding him with what could only be described as smug intelligence. The tie was slightly askew. "What's his price?" Preston asked, feeling the absurdity of the question as it left his lips. An apple slice, Laura said, holding up the green apple, freshly cut. He prefers Honeycrisp, but he'll settle for a Granny Smith in a pinch. Preston looked from the pig to the woman to the apple. He, Preston Windsor, who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a single word, was about to bribe a pig for the return of his own property. It was the most undignified moment of his life. "Fine," he clipped out. "Give me the apple." "It's not that simple," she said, a mischievous light dancing in her eyes. "You have to show him you're not a threat. You have to, get on his level." He stared at her blankly. "His level?" "Kneel," she said simply. He was going to fire his entire legal team. He was going to buy the Urban Animal Advocacy League and turn it into a luxury dog-walking service. He was going to raise this entire building and rebuild it from scratch. But first, he was going to get his tie back. With a deep, cleansing breath that did absolutely nothing to calm him, Preston loosened his own tie and slowly, stiffly, lowered himself onto one knee on the hardwood floor. His expensive trousers protested. He was now eye level with a pig. Hamlet snorted, a puff of warm air hitting Preston's face. "Okay," Laura said, her voice laced with amusement. She handed him a slice of apple. It was cool and crisp in his hand. "Now, offer it to him, gently." Preston extended the apple slice. Hamlet sniffed it, then took it with a delicate, surprising neatness. As the pig crunched happily, Preston saw his chance. His hand darted out, his fingers fumbling with the silk knot around Hamlet's neck. It was surprisingly well tied. "Honestly, this whole thing is my fault," Laura muttered, as if talking to herself while she watched the bizarre scene unfold. "I should never have tried to be a good Samaritan." Mrs. Gable was so flustered at the cleaners, dropping her laundry bag. It looked almost exactly like that little velvet pouch they put your single tie in. "I was in such a rush to help her gather her things, I must have grabbed the wrong one." The kid at the counter was so new, he didn't even check the receipts properly. Her words painted a picture. It wasn't malice or gross negligence. It was helpfulness. Misguided, chaotic helpfulness. It was a detail that made everything 10 times more infuriating. With a final tug, the knot came loose. He had it. He held the Windsor blue silk in his hand like a rescued flag. It was slightly wrinkled, and it smelled faintly of pig and apples, but it was his. He stood up, brushing off his trousers with a sharp, angry motion. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said stiffly to the pig. He turned to Laura, holding up the tie. "I trust this concludes our business." "For now," she said, her smile returning, no longer defensive but genuinely amused. "You're pretty good with pigs, for a guy in a suit that probably costs more than my car." He didn't grace that with a response. He simply turned and walked out of her apartment, the rescued tie clutched in his fist. He didn't stop until he was safely back inside his own penthouse, the door securely locked behind him. He stood in his silent foyer, the silence now feeling different. Emptier. He uncurled his fingers and looked at the tie. It was a tangible piece of chaos from the world downstairs. He could still feel the phantom warmth of the apple slice in his hand, could still see the maddening, intriguing spark in Laura Kelly's blue eyes. He had won. He had retrieved his property. He had asserted his dominance. But as he stood there, in his perfect, orderly world, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow lost. The fortress had been breached, and the enemy, a woman with a chaotic apartment and a pig named Hamlet, hadn't retreated. She had simply invited him in for a moment, and now the silence of his perfect life felt a little less like peace and a little more like loneliness. Preston Windsor did not run from problems. He eradicated them. He spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focused productivity, a whirlwind of efficiency designed to purge the memory of kneeling before a pig. He orchestrated a flawless presentation for the merger, his arguments so sharp and data-driven that the opposing board had no choice but to capitulate. He reorganized his entire South American distribution network, trimming a projected 7% inefficiency down to 1.5%. He even found time to personally recalibrate the atmospheric controls in his wine cellar. He was a machine of order, a titan of control. And yet, in the quiet moments, the chaos from downstairs crept back in. He found himself standing at his window, not admiring the skyline, but unconsciously listening for the telltale thump, thump of Hamlet's cognitive development exercises. He'd sent the Windsor blue tie out for a deep, restorative cleaning, yet he could still smell the phantom scent of apples and cedar on his hands. He'd instructed Arthur to proceed with the eviction notice, yet a part of him felt a strange, unwelcome curiosity about the Urban Animal Advocacy League and the kind of person who had them on speed dial. He dismissed it as a tactical concern. He was merely assessing his opponent's resources. That was all. The building itself seemed to be changing. The sterile, silent atmosphere of the Windsor Grand was subtly shifting. He noticed it first in the elevator. Two of his elderly residents, the formidable Mrs. Gable and her perpetually silent husband, were whispering excitedly. "And she said he can identify shapes." Mrs. Gable chirped, her voice loud enough to breach the unspoken vow of elevator silence. She holds up a little card, and he taps his snout on the circle or the square. "Can you imagine, Herbert? A pig with an understanding of geometry," Herbert grunted, which was his version of a lengthy dissertation. Preston stood in the corner, pretending to be engrossed in his phone, his jaw tightening. A pig with an understanding of geometry. His luxury residence was turning into a sideshow. Worse was his encounter with Thomas, the head doorman, a man Preston had personally trained to be a bastion of discreet professionalism. "Good evening, Mr. Windsor," Thomas said, his usual stoicism tinged with an uncharacteristic glimmer of amusement. "Quiet night." "As it should be, Thomas," Preston replied, his tone a mild warning. "Indeed, sir," Thomas continued, unable to help himself. "Although there was a small incident earlier, a delivery mix-up. A rather large bag of organic kale was sent to your penthouse by mistake. Miss Kelly was ever so apologetic when she came to retrieve it. She said Hamlet is going through a leafy greens phase." Preston stopped dead. "A bag of kale was brought to my door?" "Just for a moment, sir. I intercepted it, of course. Miss Kelly explained that the pig has a very specific diet. Apparently, he's allergic to gluten." "A gluten-intolerant pig." Preston closed his eyes, counted to 5, and walked to the elevator without another word. The fortress wasn't just breached. It was now on a mailing list for specialty produce. His breaking point arrived on Thursday evening. He was hosting a dinner. It wasn't a social event. Preston didn't socialize. It was a strategic meeting with potential Japanese investors, men who valued precision, tradition, and above all, quiet respect. He had orchestrated the evening with the precision of a military campaign. The private chef was a culinary artist. The sommelier had selected a 1982 Bordeaux. The ambiance was one of understated, powerful elegance. The first course, a delicate seared scallop, had just been served when the lights flickered, and then went out. The penthouse was plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the distant, indifferent glow of the city. A collective gasp came from his investors. Preston's mind went into immediate crisis mode. "Stay calm, gentlemen," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the sudden blackness. "The building has a state-of-the-art backup generator. Power will be restored momentarily." He waited. 1 second. 5, 10, nothing. The only sound was the nervous shuffling of his guests. His phone buzzed. It was a building-wide alert from his own management system. "Power outage detected. Cause, unidentified system failure. Please remain calm." Unidentified system failure? Impossible. He had personally overseen the installation of 3 redundant power systems. It would take a catastrophic event to knock all of them out. And then a new sound drifted up from the floor below. It was music. A scratchy, soulful melody from a vinyl record, accompanied by a clear, sweet voice singing along. And interspersed with the singing were cheerful, encouraging words. "It's okay, Hamlet. It's just the lights. Think of it as a fun camping trip. A very, very fancy camping trip." Laura Kelly. Of course. In the midst of a building-wide power failure, she was having a sing-along with her pig. His investors were beginning to murmur in Japanese, the words unreliable and infrastructure floating ominously in the dark. The multi-billion-dollar deal was flickering as precariously as the emergency lights that had failed to turn on. This was no longer an annoyance. This was a direct threat to his empire. "Gentlemen, my sincerest apologies," he said, his voice tight. "Please remain here. I will handle this personally." Using the flashlight on his phone, he navigated his way out of the penthouse and down the emergency stairwell, the sound of the singing growing louder. He arrived at her door and pounded on it, forgoing politeness for sheer urgency. The door opened a crack, illuminating her face by the warm, flickering glow of a dozen candles. She was holding a ukulele. "Mr. Windsor," she said, her voice bright and unbothered. "Fancy meeting you here. Bit of a power situation, huh? Hamlet and I were just in the middle of a rousing rendition of You Are My Sunshine." From behind her, Hamlet let out a supportive snort. "Miss Kelly, I have the board of directors from Nakatomi Industries in my apartment," he hissed, keeping his voice low. "I am trying to close the single most important deal of my career. I cannot do that in the dark." "Well, you're welcome to borrow some candles," she offered cheerfully. "I have plenty. I've got vanilla bean, lavender, even a fun one that smells like bacon." Hamlet's not a fan of that one, for obvious reasons. He ignored the offer. "Do you know anything about this? My systems are showing a localized failure. It seems to be originating from this floor." Her easy smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine concern. "Oh, goodness. Really? Well, there was a bit of a spark when I tried to plug in my lava lamp. It's a vintage one from the 70s. The wiring is a bit temperamental, but I just flipped the breaker switch back and everything seemed fine." A vintage lava lamp. An electrical grid designed for a technological fortress had been brought to its knees by a kitschy, 70-year-old novelty lamp. Preston felt a wave of lightheadedness. "Show me," he commanded, pushing past her into the apartment. The scene was surreal. Her living room, which he had only seen in the harsh light of day, was transformed by the candlelight. It was warm, cozy, and filled with dancing shadows. The book-lined walls seemed to lean in as if sharing secrets. Hamlet was curled up on a plush circular rug, his eyes closed, looking utterly peaceful. It was a haven, a den of tranquility in the middle of a blackout. Laura led him to a wall near her record player. "It was this outlet here," she said, pointing. "I plugged it in, there was a little pop, and then this." Preston examined the breaker box, a standard model for each unit. He flipped the main switch. "Nothing. You didn't just trip your own breaker, Miss Kelly. You've somehow tripped the main relay for the entire floor, and it's caused a cascade failure in the backup system." "I did that? With a lava lamp?" she asked, her voice small, genuinely horrified. "Oh my word, I am so sorry. Your dinner, your investors? Is there anything I can do?" Preston stared at the dead breaker box. His maintenance crew would take at least an hour to get here and reboot the system from the basement. The deal could be lost by then. He needed a solution now. His eyes scanned the room, his analytical mind searching for any asset, any tool he could use. And his gaze fell on the candles. Dozens of them, of all shapes and sizes, casting a warm, inviting glow. An idea began to form. A desperate, insane, completely un-Preston-like idea. "You said you had more candles," he stated, turning to face her. "Yes, tons," she confirmed, looking confused. "Why? And do you, by any chance, own a serving tray?" "A few," she said, pointing to a stack of vintage silver trays leaning against a box. "I collect them from flea markets." He looked at her, at the ridiculous ukulele still in her hand, at the pig sleeping peacefully on the rug at the warm, flickering candlelight. Then he thought of the cold, sterile darkness upstairs and the silent, nervous investors. "Miss Kelly?" he said, his voice grim, resigned to the madness of the moment. "You are about to help me save a multi-billion-dollar deal. Gather every candle you have. Find your largest, most stable tray, and for goodness sake, leave the ukulele." Laura stared at him, her blue eyes wide in the candlelight. She didn't understand, not fully, but she saw the raw urgency in his face. A slow smile spread across her lips. "Okay, Mr. Windsor," she said, putting down the ukulele. "Let's go save your deal." For the second time in a week, Preston Windsor found himself in the chaotic, unpredictable world of Laura Kelly. But this time, he wasn't there to fight it. He was there because, in the darkness, her chaos was the only light he had. For a man who orchestrated global markets, Preston Windsor suddenly felt like a junior officer in someone else's army. Laura Kelly, galvanized by a clear mission, moved with a surprising, almost dizzying efficiency. Her apartment, which he had previously dismissed as a chaotic jumble, was revealed to be a trove of organized chaos. "Okay, strategy," she announced, pulling a large silver tray from a dusty pile. "We need maximum light with minimum fire hazard. Tall, thick pillar candles in the center for base illumination, and a perimeter of votives for ambient glow. No scented ones. We don't want your investors thinking the deal smells like ocean breeze or pumpkin spice." Preston found himself nodding in agreement, momentarily forgetting that he was the one who was supposed to be in charge. Her logic was sound. He watched as she moved through the flickering darkness, gathering candles from shelves, windowsills, and a large chest he hadn't noticed before. She seemed to know the location of every single one by heart. "You have an unusually large supply of candles," he observed, his voice sounding stiff and formal in the warm, cozy space. "My grandmother always said you can survive anything if you have a good book and enough light to read it by," she replied, not looking up. She handed him a cluster of ivory-colored pillar candles. They were heavy and smelled of beeswax. "Here, you're tall. You can place them on the higher surfaces in your apartment. We want to create layers of light, draw the eye upward. It makes a space feel intentional, not just dark." Intentional. It was a word from his own lexicon, now being used to describe a solution born from a lava lamp disaster. He took the candles, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was warm. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a strange jolt through his system, an unexpected spark in the literal and figurative darkness. They worked in a strange, unspoken rhythm. He, with his long reach and methodical placement. She, with her artistic eye and rapid-fire problem-solving. In minutes, they had 2 large silver trays laden with a carefully arranged arsenal of candles. "Ready for deployment," she said, striking a final match and lighting a small votive. Its flame danced in her blue eyes. "Just one thing. What now?" he asked, his patience already wearing thin. The silent Japanese investors were waiting. "Hamlet," she said, pointing with her chin toward the sleeping pig. "He's a very light sleeper. If we leave him here alone in the dark, he'll get anxious and start to squeal. And that," she added with a pointed look, "will definitely not help your deal." Preston stared at the pig, then back at her. The implications were horrifying. "Absolutely not. We are not bringing the pig." "We're not leaving him either," she countered, her voice firm. "Look, he's perfectly content on his rug. The rug is portable. We carry the rug upstairs, place it in a quiet corner of your living room, and he won't make a peep. He'll think it's a sleepover. He loves sleepovers." Every rational fiber of Preston's being screamed in protest. Bringing the source of the contamination into the inner sanctum? It was madness. But the thought of high-pitched anxious squealing echoing through his penthouse while he tried to salvage a billion-dollar negotiation was even worse. He was trapped. "Fine," he ground out, the word tasting like defeat. "Bring the rug. But if it so much as snorts at my investors, the deal is off." "Don't threaten Hamlet," she warned, though her lips were twitching with a suppressed smile. "He'll take it as a challenge." The journey upstairs was a surreal procession. Preston led the way, his phone's flashlight cutting a sharp beam through the darkness of the stairwell. Behind him, Laura followed, carefully carrying a tray of lit candles, her face a determined mask in the flickering glow. And somehow she was also managing to drag the plush rug, with a sleeping Hamlet on top, behind her. The pig didn't stir, letting out only a soft, contented grunt as they moved. They looked like refugees from a particularly strange, pastoral apocalypse. When they reached his penthouse, the scene was grim. The investors were sitting in stiff silence, their forms barely visible silhouettes against the city lights. The private chef and sommelier were hovering uselessly in the corner, their high-tech kitchen rendered inert. "Showtime," Laura whispered, a theatrical edge to her voice. Preston took a deep breath. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice filling the cavernous room. "My apologies for the delay. We are experiencing a minor technical issue, but we have arranged an alternative ambiance." On cue, Laura swept into the room. She moved with a grace that surprised him, placing the 2 candle-laden trays on the long marble coffee table. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The room was bathed in a warm, intimate glow. The harsh, modern lines of his furniture softened. The polished chrome reflected the flames, and the glass walls multiplied them, creating 1,000 points of light. The cold, corporate space was transformed into something beautiful, something alive. The investors murmured in appreciation. The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a sense of wonder. Laura, meanwhile, had deftly and silently dragged Hamlet's rug to a far, dark corner of the room, behind a large structural pillar. The pig, still asleep, was completely out of sight. She gave Preston a quick, almost imperceptible thumbs up before melting into the shadows near the kitchen. Preston seized the opportunity. He began to speak, his voice resonating with renewed confidence. He didn't talk about infrastructure or power grids. He talked about adaptation, about finding elegant solutions in unexpected circumstances. He gestured to the candlelight. In business, as in life, he said, his words flowing smoothly, we often rely on complex systems. But true strength, true resilience, is the ability to thrive when those systems fail. It is about returning to the fundamentals, a good idea, a solid partnership, and the ability to create light in the darkness. It was, he realized with a jolt, the best he'd ever been. Freed from the rigid confines of his perfect presentation, he was speaking from the heart. He was improvising. He was channeling the chaotic, brilliant energy that had just swept into his life. The head of the Japanese delegation, Mr. Tanaka, a stern, elderly man who had barely spoken all evening, smiled. "Windsor-san," he said, his voice filled with respect. "That is a powerful philosophy. In Japan we have a term for this. Wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection." He gestured to the candlelight. "This is very wabi-sabi." The rest of the evening was a triumph. The chef, inspired, prepared a simplified third course that could be served cold. The sommelier poured the wine, its deep red color looking even richer by candlelight. The conversation flowed. The deal was not just saved, it was solidified, cemented by a shared experience of unexpected beauty. Through it all, Preston was acutely aware of Laura. She remained in the background, a silent, efficient presence. She'd somehow found his own supply of emergency candles and had begun placing them around the room, directing the chef and sommelier with quiet, confident gestures. She wasn't the chaotic neighbor from downstairs. She was a conductor, turning a disaster into a symphony. She had taken his world, broken it, and then put it back together in a way that was better, warmer, and more real. As the investors were finally preparing to leave, hours later, the power suddenly flickered back on. The harsh, bright overhead lights flooded the room, shattering the magical atmosphere. Everyone blinked, momentarily disoriented. The warm, intimate haven was once again a cold, minimalist penthouse. It felt like a loss. "Ah," Mr. Tanaka said, a hint of disappointment in his voice. "The modern world returns." He bowed deeply to Preston. "Thank you for a most illuminating evening, Windsor-san. We will have our people draw up the final papers in the morning." Preston shook his hand, his mind reeling. He had done it. He had closed the deal. But as he walked his guests to the elevator, he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that he hadn't done it alone. When he returned, the living room was empty, save for the extinguished candles and the lingering scent of wax and victory. Laura was gone. He walked to the corner where she had placed the pig. The rug was gone too. There was no trace that they had ever been there, except for a single small piece of paper left on the floor. He bent down and picked it up. It was a napkin, and written on it in neat, feminine script were 3 words, "You're welcome." He stood there for a long time, the napkin in his hand, the silence of his perfect, well-lit apartment pressing in on him. He had spent his entire life building walls to keep chaos out. But tonight, chaos had a name, a face, and an uncanny ability to arrange candles. And for the first time in his meticulously ordered life, Preston Windsor found himself hoping the walls had a few more cracks in them. The morning after the blackout felt unnaturally bright. Preston stood at his window, a cup of perfectly brewed coffee in hand, and stared down at the city. But his mind was not on the familiar grid of streets and commerce. It was on the events of the previous night. The memory played in a loop. The sudden darkness, the scent of vanilla and beeswax, the warm, flickering glow of candlelight on the faces of his investors, and Laura Kelly moving through the chaos with the serene confidence of a conductor. He had won. The Nakatomi deal was signed, sealed, and already making positive waves in the morning's financial news. His phone had been buzzing since dawn with congratulatory messages. By all objective measures, it was a monumental victory. Yet the victory felt hollow, incomplete. It felt shared. He glanced at the marble coffee table, now cleared and polished back to its sterile perfection. The napkin with her handwriting was tucked safely in the breast pocket of his suit jacket from last night. "You're welcome." 3 simple words that carried the weight of a silent partnership. His own systems had failed him. His meticulous planning, his redundant power grids, his entire philosophy of control, all had crumbled in the face of a vintage lava lamp. and a woman with a ukulele and a pig had saved him. It was a truth so profoundly illogical, so deeply unsettling to his core beliefs, that he didn't know how to process it. His first call of the day was to Arthur Vance. "Preston." Arthur's voice was crisp. "Congratulations on the Nakatomi deal. Heard it was a spectacular closing. Now about the eviction of Miss Kelly. I've drafted a second, more aggressive notice. We can have it served by noon." Preston looked at the napkin, which he had placed on his desk. "Hold," he said. There was a pause. "Hold? Preston, did you say hold? As in pause legal action?" "That is the standard definition of the word, Arthur. Yes," Preston replied, a hint of irritation in his voice. He wasn't irritated at Arthur. He was irritated at himself for the words he was about to say. There was a development. Miss Kelly rendered a significant service to the corporation last night, an act of goodwill that directly contributed to the successful closing of the deal. He could almost hear Arthur's perfectly tailored suit wrinkling in confusion over the phone. A significant service? The woman with the pig? "The details are not relevant," Preston said quickly, unwilling to recount the surreal tale of Operation Candelabro. "What is relevant is that proceeding with an eviction at this exact moment would be unseemly. Bad form." "Bad form," Arthur repeated, the words sounding alien in his mouth. "Preston, you once sued a man for planting petunias in his window box because the shade of pink clashed with the building's exterior aesthetic. You don't do bad form, you do scorched earth litigation. What's really going on?" Preston ran a hand over his face. What was going on? He was protecting the woman who was the living embodiment of everything he stood against. "Just put a pin in it, Arthur. Let the file sit on your desk. I will advise when to proceed." He hung up before his lawyer could ask any more probing questions. He knew what he had to do. An act of goodwill required a reciprocal act. It was a fundamental rule of business, of etiquette, of something. He couldn't simply ignore what she had done. A simple thank you felt insufficient. He needed to make a gesture. His first instinct, the one honed by years of corporate life, was money, a check. A large, generous, problem-solving check that would serve as both a thank you and a clear, final transaction. He could write it for an amount that would make her eyes water, an amount that would say, "We are even now. Our business is concluded. Please keep your pig and your lava lamp away from my electrical grid." But as he imagined sliding that check under her door, the image felt wrong. It felt cheap. It felt like an attempt to buy his way out of a debt that wasn't financial. He remembered her face in the candlelight, the genuine horror when she realized what her lava lamp had done, her unhesitating willingness to help. She hadn't asked for payment. She had acted out of simple, chaotic decency. To offer money would be to misunderstand the entire exchange. It would be an insult. So what then? A gift, a bottle of champagne, a gift basket filled with artisanal cheeses and gluten-free crackers for the pig? The ideas all felt hollow, impersonal. They were the standard gestures of the Preston Windsor playbook. And he knew, instinctively, that they would fail. He needed to do something that acknowledged her. Not the problem she represented, but the person she was. And he realized, with a sinking feeling, that he knew almost nothing about her. He knew she liked old books, fleas, and sang to her pig. It wasn't much to go on. He found himself pacing his apartment again, his mind, usually so clear, a fog of indecision. He passed the kitchen and a thought struck him. The private chef. He could have the chef prepare an exquisite meal for her. But that still felt like a transaction, a delegation of his own responsibility. Frustrated, he went to his front door, intending to go for a walk to clear his head. As he pulled the heavy door open, he almost collided with a small, wobbling tower of something. It was Laura, her arms laden with 3 large, fragrant bags of potting soil. She had a smudge of dirt on her nose, and her hair was held back by a bandana. She was humming. "Oh," she yelped, stumbling back. One of the bags slipped. Preston's reflexes, honed by years of squash, were instantaneous. He shot a hand out and caught the bag before it could hit the marble floor. "Careful," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. The bag was surprisingly heavy. "Thanks," she panted, readjusting her grip on the other 2. "Gardening day. The balcony of my apartment gets amazing afternoon sun. I'm starting a small herb garden, and maybe some tomatoes." He looked at the bags of soil, then at her. Her face was flushed with exertion, her eyes bright. She was creating something, cultivating life on a sterile balcony 34 floors in the sky. It was the most Laura Kelly thing he could possibly imagine. "You're gardening," he stated, as if the concept were a complex scientific theory. "Trying to," she said with a laugh. "It's a bit of a workout getting the supplies up here. The service elevator is being repaired today, of all days." And that's when he saw it. An opportunity. A way to make a gesture that wasn't about money or gifts, but about simple, practical effort. It was a terrifying, humbling, and utterly correct idea. "You need help," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him, then at his immaculate $1,000 suit. She laughed, a genuine, uninhibited sound that echoed in the quiet hallway. "With all due respect, Mr. Windsor, you don't look like a man who's on intimate terms with potting soil." "Nevertheless," he said, his jaw set with a resolve that surprised even himself. He took the other 2 bags from her arms. They were heavier than they looked, and the rough plastic felt alien in his hands. "Where are we going?" She stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. For the first time since they'd met, Laura Kelly seemed to be at a loss for words. You're serious?" "I do not joke about manual labor," he said grimly. A slow, incredulous smile spread across her face. "Okay then, Mr. Windsor, follow me. Welcome to the jungle." He followed her into her apartment. In the daylight, it was even more chaotic and colorful than he remembered. She led him through the living room, where Hamlet was currently nudging a bright red ball with his snout, the picture of porcine concentration. The pig glanced up as they passed, gave a small snort of acknowledgement, and went back to his game. The balcony was a blank slate of concrete and glass. A collection of empty terracotta pots of various sizes was stacked in a corner. The city stretched out before them, a breathtaking vista of steel and ambition. "Just here is fine," she said, gesturing to a clear space. He set the bags down with more relief than he would ever admit. He could feel a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. She looked at him, really looked at him, and the amusement in her eyes was replaced by genuine curiosity. "Why are you doing this?" He stood stiffly, brushing imaginary dust from his suit jacket. "Last night," he began, the words feeling formal and inadequate, "your assistance was instrumental. I wanted to express my gratitude." "So you're my soil Sherpa for the day? That's your idea of a thank you?" she asked, a playful glint returning to her eyes. It seemed more appropriate than a cash bonus, he admitted, his honesty surprising them both. Her smile softened. "Yeah," she said quietly. "It is." She bent down and ripped open one of the bags. The rich, earthy smell of soil filled the air. "Well, as long as you're here, ever potted a plant before?" He looked at the black soil, then at his pristine, manicured hands. "I have not." "There's a first time for everything," she said, scooping a trowelful of soil into a small pot. "It's easy. Just don't be afraid to get your hands dirty." He watched her for a moment. She worked with a natural, unstudied grace, her movements efficient and joyful. She was in her element. He, on the other hand, felt like an alien visitor on a strange new planet. But he had come this far. He took off his suit jacket, folded it with military precision, and placed it on a clean box. He rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt. Then, with the deep, fortifying breath of a man about to dive into shark-infested waters, he knelt down, reached into the bag, and plunged his hands into the cool, dark earth. It was soft, yielding, and felt more real than anything he had touched all day. The sensation of the soil was utterly foreign to Preston. It was cool and damp, clinging to his skin and lodging beneath his fingernails. For the first few minutes, every fiber of his being recoiled. This was dirt. Filth. The very essence of the unmanicured, disorderly world he had spent his life cordoning off. He felt a primal urge to bolt, to find the nearest sink and scrub his hands raw. But then he looked at Laura. She was completely at ease, a serene smile on her face as she expertly filled a terracotta pot, her hands moving with a practiced rhythm. There was no revulsion on her face, only a quiet, focused joy. She was not just touching dirt, she was interacting with the potential for life. He took a breath and forced his hands back into the bag. He tried to mimic her movements, scooping the soil into a medium-sized pot. He was clumsy, spilling more than he kept, creating a small, dark mountain on the pristine concrete of the balcony. "You're thinking too much," she said, not looking at him. "It's not a hostile takeover. You don't need to dominate the soil, you just need to guide it. He stopped, his hands poised over the pot. I am not trying to dominate it. Aren't you? She finally turned to him, a knowing glint in her eye. You're approaching this like it's a problem on a spreadsheet. Calculate the volume, execute the transfer, minimize spillage. That's not how it works. It's supposed to be a little messy. She reached over and, with a gentle sweep of her hand, brushed some of the spilled soil into his pot. See? It's forgiving. He watched her, a strange feeling unfurling in his chest. No one had ever told him it was okay to be messy. His entire life had been a crusade against messiness in all its forms. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the soft scrape of trowels and the distant hum of the city. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, companionable. He found a rhythm, his movements becoming less stiff, more fluid. He was still clumsy, but he was no longer fighting the process. So, she said, breaking the quiet as she gently placed a small basil seedling into a pot. A billionaire CEO who moonlights as a gardener's assistant. What's your story, Mr. Windsor? Preston, he corrected her, the name leaving his lips before he'd consciously decided to offer it. And my story is not particularly interesting. I run a company. I live here. That's about it. I don't believe that for a second, she said, patting the soil around the base of the seedling with a maternal tenderness. Nobody's story is that's about it. Everybody has a why. Why this building? Why the rule about no pets? It seems personal. He stiffened. He hadn't expected the conversation to turn so directly toward his most deeply ingrained neuroses. He thought about his father's ruined architectural model, the splintered balsa wood, the crushing disappointment. He had never spoken of it to anyone. I believe that control and order are the prerequisites for success, he said, the words a well-rehearsed mantra. Animals are, by their nature, agents of chaos. Or maybe they're just agents of love, she countered softly. She looked up from her work, her gaze direct and searching, which can feel a lot like chaos if you're not used to it. He had no answer for that. He shifted the topic back to her, a safer territory. And what is your why? Why a pig, Miss Kelly? Laura, she corrected him with a smile. And Hamlet. He's my why. My story's a bit messier than yours, I think. She paused, her hands still in the soil. I used to be a veterinary tech, a very stressed, overworked, underpaid vet tech at a clinic that dealt with large animals. I loved the work, but it was heartbreaking. You see the best and the worst of humanity. She looked out at the city, but her eyes were seeing something far away. A few years ago, there was a case, a petting zoo that had gone bankrupt. The owners just abandoned the animals. We worked for days, trying to rescue and relocate them. Hamlet was just a tiny piglet then, the runt of the litter, sick and terrified. No one wanted him. He was scheduled to be put down. Preston watched her face, the memory casting a shadow over her bright features. I couldn't let it happen, she continued, her voice quiet. I looked into his beady little eyes, and I saw this spark, this stubborn refusal to give up. So I did a stupid, impulsive thing. I smuggled him out in my oversized tote bag. I nursed him back to health in my tiny apartment. He became my roommate, my confidant, my emotional support pig. She smiled, a sad, sweet expression. He saved me as much as I saved him. When the world felt too loud or too cruel, he was just there. A solid, warm, snorting presence that didn't care if I was a success or a failure. He just cared if I had a spare piece of apple. He reminds me to stay grounded. Literally. Preston looked through the glass door at Hamlet, who was now snoozing on his rug, letting out a soft, whistling snore. He was no longer just a pig. He was a symbol of defiance, a rescued soul who had, in turn, rescued another. He suddenly understood her fierce protectiveness, her refusal to back down. Hamlet wasn't a pet, he was a partner. After that, I couldn't go back to the clinic, Laura said, her voice returning to its usual cheerful tone as she shook off the sad memory. I decided I needed a change. I started my own small business, designing and selling custom terrariums and indoor gardens online. Urban Roots, it's called. It lets me bring a little bit of green, a little bit of life into sterile places. She gestured around at the concrete jungle surrounding them, like this. It all clicked into place. The bags of soil, the encyclopedic knowledge of candles, the effortless way she created a haven out of a blackout. She was a cultivator, a life bringer. She walked into sterile places and made them grow. And that's why you're here, he said, the realization dawning on him. You moved into the most sterile building in the city. It was the only place with an apartment big enough for Hamlet's play area that I could afford, thanks to a surprisingly successful quarter, she said with a laugh. But yes, maybe subconsciously, I was drawn to the challenge. She looked at him, her smile fading into something more serious. And maybe you need a little bit of chaos in your life, Preston. He opened his mouth to deliver a well-practiced retort about the virtues of order, but the words wouldn't come. He thought of his silent, empty penthouse, his perfectly arranged, perfectly lonely life. He thought of how the candlelight had made his apartment feel like a home for the very first time. Maybe, he conceded, the single word feeling like a monumental admission. They finished potting the herbs and the tomato plants, their conversation flowing more easily now. He learned that she had grown up on a small farm, that she collected vintage jazz records, and that her favorite food in the world was a perfectly ripe peach. He, in turn, found himself telling her about his grandfather, the man who had given him the Windsor blue tie, a man who had been a titan of industry, but who had also kept a small, wild garden on the roof of his first office building. It was a memory he hadn't thought of in years. By the time they were done, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the balcony. A row of neat, promising pots stood ready, a tiny, defiant farm against the backdrop of a concrete world. Preston's hands were caked in dirt, his knees ached, his shirt was probably ruined, and he felt good. Better than he had felt after closing the Nakatomi deal. He felt a sense of quiet, grounded accomplishment. He had helped create something. Not bad for a beginner, Laura said, surveying their work with a proud smile. You're a natural at tamping soil, very authoritative. A skill I will be sure to add to my resume, he said, a dry smile touching his own lips. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands as best he could. I should go, she said, her smile faltering slightly. Well, thank you, Preston, for the help. It would have taken me all day on my own. It was my pleasure, he said, and was shocked to realize he meant it. He walked back through her apartment. Hamlet was awake now and trotted over to him, nudging his leg with a wet snout. On instinct, Preston reached down and scratched the pig behind his coarse, bristly ears. Hamlet leaned into his touch with a happy grunt. Laura watched the interaction, an unreadable expression on her face. Preston straightened up, clearing his throat, feeling flustered. Good evening, Laura. Good evening, Preston. He let himself out, the door clicking softly behind him. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looking down at his dirt-caked hands. He should have felt disgusted. He should have been horrified by the breach of his own sterile protocols. Instead, all he could think about was the surprising warmth of the soil, the easy sound of her laughter, and the undeniable fact that for the first time in a very, very long time, his perfectly ordered world had felt for a few hours wonderfully, terrifyingly alive. The dirt under Preston's fingernails was a stubborn, silent reminder. Despite a rigorous session with a nail brush that bordered on surgical, a faint, dark line remained under the nail of his index finger. It was a tiny imperfection, a smudge on his otherwise flawless canvas, and yet he found he didn't entirely mind. It was evidence. Proof that the strange, grounding peace he'd felt on Laura's balcony hadn't been a hallucination. His world, however, attempted to snap back to its default settings. Meetings were attended, calls were made, billions of dollars continued their restless dance across global markets. But something had shifted inside him. The relentless efficiency of his life, once a source of pride, now felt sterile. The silence in his penthouse was no longer tranquil, it was simply empty. He found himself noticing things he'd previously ignored. The way the afternoon sun hit the spot on Laura's balcony where they had placed the tomato plants. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of basil that sometimes drifted up when the wind was just right. He even caught himself pausing by the abstract sculpture in the hallway, the one Hamlet had snuffled, and wondering for the first time what the artist had been trying to convey. The building continued its subtle transformation. Laura Kelly, it seemed, was not just a resident. She was a gentle, gravitational force, pulling the disparate, isolated inhabitants of the Windsor Grand into a semblance of a community. He saw it in the lobby one morning. Mrs. Gable, who typically only spoke to complain about the temperature of the lap pool, was cooing at Hamlet, who was sitting patiently by Laura's feet, wearing a ridiculously small, knitted blue bow tie. "Oh, he's just the most intelligent little gentleman," Mrs. Gable was saying, her wrinkled face alight with a joy Preston had never seen on her. "Did you know he can already differentiate between his red ball and his blue ball? Remarkable." Laura smiled, a warm, genuine expression. "He's a quick study. We're working on shapes next." Preston slipped past them, feeling like an invisible ghost in his own building. He had designed the Windsor Grand to be a collection of private, silent sanctuaries. Laura Kelly was turning it into a neighborhood. Even Thomas, the doorman, was a changed man. His professional stoicism was now frequently cracked by a warm smile whenever Laura passed. "She brings me a coffee sometimes," Thomas confided in Preston one afternoon, his voice low and conspiratorial. "And she always asks about my daughter's piano lessons. A very thoughtful woman, Miss Kelly." He then added, with a twinkle in his eye, "And the little fellow Hamlet is no trouble at all. Very dignified for a pig." Preston just nodded, the word dignified ringing in his ears. The entire world, it seemed, had fallen under the spell of his chaotic, pig-owning neighbor. His eviction notice, still sitting dormant in Arthur's files, felt less like a tool of order and more like an artifact from a bygone era. He had no intention of using it. The thought of Laura's vibrant, messy life being extinguished from the building now felt like a loss he was unwilling to entertain. The next test of his new reality came a week later. He was hosting another dinner. This one was smaller, more intimate, but no less important. His guest was Eleanor Vance, the most feared and respected food critic in the country, a woman whose single review could make or break a restaurant's legacy. She was doing a feature on exclusive private chefs, and Preston's own, the temperamental culinary genius Jean-Pierre, was her subject. The evening was unfolding with the flawless precision Preston demanded. The apartment was immaculate. The lighting was perfect and fully functional. The first 2 courses had been met with Eleanor's signature, non-committal hums, which Jean-Pierre assured him was high praise. The main course was to be the pièce de résistance, a pan-seared bronzino with a delicate lemon basil vinaigrette. It was a dish that depended entirely on the freshness and aromatic quality of the basil. 10 minutes before it was due to be served, Jean-Pierre burst out of the kitchen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His towering chef's hat was askew. "Monsieur Windsor," he whispered, his French accent thick with horror. "We have a catastrophe." "Breathe, Jean-Pierre," Preston said calmly. "What is it?" "The basil," the chef lamented, wringing his hands. "The micro-basil I had flown in from the Amalfi Coast, it has wilted. The refrigeration unit had a slight fluctuation. It is unusable. It is brown. It is a tragedy." Preston stared at him. A tragedy. His world seemed to be plagued by small domestic apocalypses. "Use the backup supply," he said simply. "There is no backup," Jean-Pierre wailed. "For this dish, for Madame Vance, it must be perfectly fresh. The entire flavor profile depends upon it. The dish is ruined. My reputation. Your evening." Preston's mind raced. Canceling the course was not an option. Serving it with subpar ingredients was even worse. He needed fresh basil right now, in the middle of a dinner party. An impossible task. And then an image flashed in his mind. A row of terracotta pots on a sun-drenched balcony. A small, vibrant basil plant, its leaves green and fragrant. The plant he had potted with his own 2 hands. The idea insane. He was about to interrupt a high-stakes dinner to ask his neighbor for a handful of herbs. But the alternative, failure, was unthinkable. "Stay here," he commanded the frantic chef. "Do not say a word. I will handle this." He excused himself from the table, offering a smooth, practiced apology about needing to take an urgent international call. Eleanor Vance merely nodded, her sharp eyes following him as he left the room. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs, his heart pounding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. It wasn't the adrenaline of a business deal. It was something else. Anticipation. Apprehension. He knocked on her door, the sound softer than it had been the last time. She opened it, and his breath caught in his throat. She wasn't in one of her quirky t-shirts. She was wearing a simple, dark blue dress that made her eyes look like jewels. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She was in the middle of a video call, a laptop open on her dining table. "Preston," she said, her surprise evident. She muted her microphone. Is everything okay? Not another blackout, I hope. No, he said, feeling strangely awkward. I have a request, a rather unusual one. I'm learning that's your specialty, she teased, a small smile playing on her lips. What's up? I require basil, he said, the word feeling ridiculous. Fresh basil. Just a few sprigs. It's an emergency. Her eyebrows shot up. A basil emergency? That's a new one. Is everything all right upstairs? I have a food critic in my apartment. My chef is on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and the fate of my culinary reputation rests on a vinaigrette, he explained, the words tumbling out in a rush. Her smile widened into a full, brilliant grin. Well, in that case, the Urban Roots Herb Garden is at your service. She gestured for him to come in. Come on, let's go save your vinaigrette. He followed her onto the balcony. The little garden was thriving. The tomato plants had grown and the herb pots were overflowing with fragrant green life. It was a testament to her care, her nurturing spirit. She knelt down, her blue dress pooling around her on the concrete. She snipped a generous handful of basil leaves with a small pair of scissors, the sharp, clean scent filling the night air. She cupped them in her hands and offered them to him. Will this be enough for your culinary crisis? She asked, her eyes sparkling under the balcony light. He took the leaves, their fragrance intoxicating. They were still warm from the last of the day's sun. It's perfect, he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. Thank you, Laura. Anytime, she said, standing up and brushing her hands on her dress. That's what neighbors are for, right? Borrowing a cup of sugar, a handful of basil, helping to avert a billion-dollar catastrophe. The usual stuff. He found himself smiling, a real, unforced smile. Right, the usual stuff. He should have left then. He had the basil. The crisis was averted. But he didn't move. You look nice, he said, the words surprising him as much as her. Her cheeks flushed, a faint pink that was visible even in the dim light. Oh, thanks. I had a video meeting with a potential distributor in California. Trying to look professional. It's working, he said. He looked back into her apartment, at the laptop on the table. Urban Roots is expanding? Fingers crossed, she said, her voice filled with a hopeful energy that was so purely her. They're a big deal, a chain of organic markets. It could change everything for me. He felt a sudden, fierce desire for her to succeed. They'd be fools not to sign you. Their eyes met and held for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The air between them was charged, filled with the unspoken events of the past weeks. The tie, the blackout, the soil, and now this. You should get back to your critic, she said, breaking the silence. Right, he said, snapping back to the present. The vinaigrette. He returned to his penthouse, the fragrant basil clutched in his hand like a precious jewel. He handed it to Jean-Pierre, whose face lit up with the fervent relief of a condemned man granted a last-minute pardon. The branzino was served. Eleanor Vance took a delicate bite. She closed her eyes, chewing slowly, her face an unreadable mask. The silence stretched for an eternity. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Preston. Windsor? She said, her voice a low, authoritative purr. The fish is cooked to perfection. But this basil, she took another small bite. This basil is alive. It tastes of sunshine and something else. Something real. It's not from a hydroponic farm or a sterile greenhouse. Where on earth did you get it? Jean-Pierre looked at him, his eyes wide with panic, ready to invent a story about a secret Amalfi garden. But Preston didn't hesitate. He looked at the most powerful food critic in the world and told the simple, unvarnished truth. It was grown a few floors below here, he said, his voice clear and steady. On a balcony, by my neighbor. Eleanor Vance's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose in surprise. She looked intrigued. Indeed? Well, you tell your neighbor, she said, taking a final, decisive bite, that she has a remarkable gift. The praise was for Laura, but it landed in Preston's chest like a personal victory. A victory that tasted, remarkably, of fresh basil and unexpected connections. Preston woke the next morning to a world that felt fundamentally different. The praise from Eleanor Vance had echoed in his mind all night. It tastes of sunshine and something real. She hadn't just been talking about the basil. She had, in her own incisive way, perfectly described Laura Kelly. He looked around his penthouse. The minimalist furniture, the polished chrome, the vast expanses of silent, empty space, it all suddenly felt less like a symbol of success and more like a beautifully designed cage. A cage he had built for himself, brick by sterile brick. Laura, with her chaotic joy and balcony garden, was living a life of authentic flavor. He was living in a perfectly preserved, flavorless vacuum. The first order of business was to dismantle a piece of that cage. He picked up his phone and dialed Arthur Vance. "Arthur," he said, his voice firm and decisive. "The file on Miss Kelly. I want you to shred it." "Shred it?" Arthur sounded as if Preston had just asked him to start wearing novelty ties. As in, destroy all records? "Preston, are you feeling all right? We have a strong case here, despite the porcine complications." "The case is closed, Arthur," Preston stated, leaving no room for argument. "The eviction is cancelled permanently. Send a formal letter of retraction to her and to her advocacy league. Cite a clerical error. And send a basket of muffins, the good ones from that bakery on Madison." "Muffins?" Arthur's voice was now a faint squeak of bewilderment. "Preston, are you under duress? Is the pig in the room with you right now? Blink twice if you need me to send help." "Just do it, Arthur," Preston said, a faint smile touching his lips. "And the muffins are not a legal strategy. They are a courtesy." He hung up, feeling a profound sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had officially surrendered in a war he no longer wanted to fight. Now, for the more complex matter, gratitude. The basil had been more than just an ingredient. It had been a lifeline. He owed her, and the debt felt personal. He thought about her video call, her excitement about the potential distributor. "It could change everything for me." An idea, clear and sharp, cut through the morning fog. He knew business. He knew scaling, logistics, branding, and negotiation. He knew how to turn a small, passionate enterprise into a powerhouse. For years, he had used those skills to build his own empire, to amass wealth and power for himself. What if, for the first time, he used them for someone else? Not as a transaction, but as a genuine act of support. He spent the next hour at his desk, not looking at his own company's projections, but sketching out a preliminary analysis for a small, bespoke terrarium business. He thought about supply chains for artisanal materials, e-commerce platform optimization, and branding strategies that would appeal to a high-end organic market. His mind, which had felt sluggish and uninspired for months, was electric with ideas. He showered, changed not into a suit, but into a pair of well-tailored trousers and a cashmere sweater, still his armor, but a softer version. He took the elevator down to her floor, his heart beating with a nervous energy he hadn't felt since his very first boardroom pitch. When she opened the door, she was back in her natural habitat. Jeans, a t-shirt that said "Talk Dirt to Me," and a light dusting of flour on her cheek. She was holding a wooden spoon. "Preston," she said, her smile immediate and warm. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Another culinary emergency?" "No," he said, trying to sound casual and failing. "Actually, I came to thank you, properly." "You already did that," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "You brought my soil up. We're even." "Not in my ledger," he replied. "You saved a very important evening for me. And Eleanor Vance, she was impressed. She said you have a remarkable gift." Laura's eyes widened, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face. "She said that? The Eleanor Vance? About my basil?" "She did," he confirmed, enjoying the look of delight on her face. "Which brings me to my proposal. You mentioned a potential distributor, a chain of organic markets." "Yes, Golden Sprout Markets," she said, her voice filled with a mix of hope and anxiety. "The video call went well, I think. They asked me to submit a full business plan and a scaling proposal by next week. It's a little overwhelming, to be honest." This was his opening. "I'd like to offer my services," he said, the words feeling both bold and inadequate. "As a consultant, I know a thing or two about scaling proposals. I could look it over for you. Offer some thoughts." She stared at him, her blue eyes searching his face, trying to understand his angle. "You want to help me with my business plan?" Preston Windsor, the corporate titan, wants to help a woman who makes terrariums in her living room? "I believe in paying my debts," he said simply. "And I believe Eleanor Vance was right. You have a gift. A business plan should reflect the value of that gift." Her expression softened, the suspicion replaced by a hesitant gratitude. I don't know what to say. I couldn't possibly pay your consulting fee. My fee, he said, a real smile breaking through his formal exterior, is a cup of coffee, and perhaps a promise not to plug in any more vintage lava lamps. She laughed, a bright, happy sound that made the hallway feel less empty. Deal, she said. Come in, the battlefield is this way. He followed her to the dining table, which was covered in a sea of papers, notebooks, and hand-drawn sketches of terrariums. In the center of it all was her laptop, open to a half-finished spreadsheet. Hamlet was asleep nearby, his snores a gentle, rhythmic counterpoint to their conversation. For the next 3 hours, the world outside the Windsor Grand ceased to exist. He listened as she spoke about urban roots, and he was captivated. She didn't talk like a CEO, using buzzwords and corporate jargon. She talked with a fiery, infectious passion. She spoke of biophilic design, of the psychological benefits of bringing nature indoors, of creating living art that could thrive in small urban spaces. She didn't just sell plants in glass jars, she sold tiny, accessible worlds of peace and beauty. He, in turn, found himself opening up in a way he never did. He took her passionate, creative vision and began to translate it into the language of business. He didn't dismiss her ideas, he refined them. Your production cost per unit is too high, he said, pointing to a line on her spreadsheet. You're sourcing your moss from a retail supplier. I know a wholesaler in Oregon who supplies the film industry. Their quality is unmatched, and you could cut your costs by 40% if you buy in bulk. She stared at him, her pen hovering over the notebook. How do you know that? I once considered acquiring a special effects company, he said with a shrug. The deal fell through, but I never forget a good supplier. He helped her structure her proposal, breaking it down into clear, actionable sections: market analysis, brand identity, production and fulfillment, financial projections. He taught her how to frame her small size not as a weakness, but as a strength, a guarantee of artisanal quality and personal touch in a world of mass production. She was a fast learner, her mind sharp and intuitive. She absorbed every piece of advice, asking intelligent questions that challenged his own assumptions. He realized he wasn't just mentoring her, he was collaborating with her. Her creativity and his strategic mind were a potent combination. Okay, she said, leaning back in her chair, a look of exhausted triumph on her face. I think I can actually do this. This looks like a real business plan now, not just a bunch of hopeful dreams on a page. She looked at him, her gratitude so open and sincere it made his chest ache. I can't thank you enough, Preston. You already have, he said, his voice low. The coffee cups were empty. The sun was setting, filling her apartment with a soft, golden light. The pretense of business had evaporated, leaving something else in its place. A quiet intimacy, a shared sense of accomplishment. I should let you get back to your world dominating, she said, her voice a little shaky. My world can wait. He found himself saying. He looked at her, at the dusting of flowers still on her cheek, at the way the setting sun caught the honey-colored strands of her hair. He had an overwhelming urge to reach out and wipe the flower away himself. He restrained himself, but only just. You know, he said, his voice barely a whisper, this was the most interesting merger I've worked on all year. She looked up at him, her breath catching. The air in the room grew thick, charged with unspoken words and untapped potential. The line between them had been crossed. They were no longer just a CEO and his chaotic neighbor. They were Preston and Laura. And they were, he realized with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, just getting started. The week that followed their business plan marathon was a strange and unsettling limbo for Preston. He found himself manufacturing reasons to go downstairs. Once, he claimed to be checking the hallway's ambient temperature sensors. Another time, he pretended to have lost a cufflink near her door. Each time, he was greeted by Laura's warm, knowing smile, a cup of coffee offered without question, and a brief, tantalizing glimpse into her world of organized chaos. Their conversations were light and easy, skirting the edge of the deep, charged intimacy they had discovered while hunched over her laptop. They talked about the weather, about Hamlet's newfound passion for chasing sunbeams, about a vintage jazz record she'd found. They were like two planets that had knocked each other off their orbits, now circling one another cautiously, unsure of the new gravitational pull between them. Preston had never felt so off balance. He, a man whose life was a testament to linear progression and predictable outcomes, was caught in a state of hopeful uncertainty. He had officially canceled the war, but he had no idea how to negotiate the peace. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday morning by a frantic knock on his penthouse door. He opened it to find Laura, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terrifying combination of elation and panic. She was holding her phone as if it were a live grenade. "I got it," she breathed, her voice a squeak. "Golden Sprout, they love the plan. They said it was one of the most professional and passionate proposals they've ever seen." A surge of pride, fierce and protective, shot through Preston. "Laura, that's incredible news. Congratulations." "Don't congratulate me yet," she said, waving her phone frantically. "There's a catch. A big, scary, transcontinental catch." She took a deep breath. "They want me to fly out to their headquarters in San Francisco this Friday. They want me to give an in-person presentation to the entire executive board. And," she squeaked the last word, "they want me to set up a demonstration booth at their annual flagship store artisan fair on Saturday to gauge public reaction in real time." Preston processed the information. It was a standard final step for a major distribution deal. A trial by fire. "That's a good sign, Laura. It means they're serious. They're testing your poise under pressure." "My poise?" she repeated, her voice rising in hysteria. "Preston, I don't have poise. I have potting soil and a pig. I've never given a presentation to more than 3 people, and one of them was Hamlet. An executive board? An artisan fair? I'm going to stand up there, babble about moss, and faint. I'm going to faint into a terrarium, and my career will be over before it even starts." He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes. This wasn't the defiant, resilient woman who had stood up to him in the hallway. This was a creative soul being dragged into the corporate arena. And she was terrified. His first instinct was the old Preston, the problem solver, the delegator. "I'll handle it," he said instantly. "I'll have my best presentation team create a deck for you. We'll hire a public speaking coach. I'll send my head of logistics to manage the booth setup. You won't have to do a thing except show up and read the slides." He thought it was the perfect solution. He was offering her the full, overwhelming force of the Windsor Holdings machine. He was offering her victory on a silver platter, but she just stared at him, her panic slowly being replaced by a firm, resolute disappointment. "No," she said quietly. He was taken aback. "No, Laura, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. There's no room for error." "That's exactly why I have to do it myself," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't Windsor Holdings, Preston. It's Urban Roots. It's me. If they're buying my product, they're buying my passion, my story. They're not buying a slick presentation from your corporate team. If I can't stand up and speak for my own dream, then I don't deserve to have it." He looked at her, at the fierce integrity burning in her eyes, and felt a profound sense of shame. He had, once again, completely misunderstood. He had offered to solve her problem with money and power, the only tools he'd ever known. But she was reminding him that some things couldn't be delegated. Some things had to be earned. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "You're absolutely right. I'm sorry." She deflated slightly, the fight going out of her. "But I'm still terrified," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't even know where to begin." He looked at her, standing there so brave and so vulnerable, and a new plan formed in his mind. A better plan. A plan that wasn't about delegation, but about partnership. "Then you won't begin alone," he said. He took a step closer. "I'm clearing my schedule for the rest of the week. No meetings, no calls. My entire focus is Urban Roots. You and I are going to build this presentation together from the ground up. I'll be your coach, your strategist, and your audience. We will work until you can give this presentation in your sleep." And then, he took a deep breath, committing to the madness. "I'm coming with you to San Francisco. I'll be your logistics manager, your roadie, your emotional support human." Laura's jaw dropped. She stared at him, speechless. "You'd do that? You'd drop everything for my terrariums?" "I told you," he said, his gaze intense. "I believe in your gift, and I never back a losing investment." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We are going to make them believe in it too." The next 72 hours were a blur of focused, caffeine-fueled intensity. Laura's apartment became their command center. They turned her dining table into a war room, covering it with storyboards, product samples, and note cards. Preston's penthouse became the practice stage. He was a relentless coach. He made her stand in the center of his vast living room, the empty space, a stand-in for a boardroom, and deliver her pitch over and over again. Again, he would say, his voice firm but not unkind. Louder. Project your voice. You are not asking for their attention, you are commanding it. But I feel like I'm yelling, she'd protest, her shoulders slumped. He'd walk over to her, gently adjusting her posture. Stand up straight, shoulders back, own the space. His hands would linger on her shoulders for a fraction of a second, a warm, steadying pressure. You are the expert in this room. No one knows more about this than you. That is your power. Use it. In turn, she was his teacher. When he tried to fill her speech with cold, hard metrics and financial jargon, she would stop him. No, she'd say, shaking her head. That's your language, not mine. I don't sell ROI, I sell peace of mind. I sell a moment of green in a world of gray. She would pick up one of her terrariums, a beautiful glass globe containing a miniature world of ferns and moss. I sell this. The feeling you get when you look at it. How do I put that on a slide? Together they found a new language, one that blended her passion with his precision. They wove a story, not just a pitch. They talked about the science of biophilia, but also about the simple joy of watching something grow. They worked late into the night, fueled by takeout pizza and a shared, escalating sense of purpose. In the quiet, exhausted hours after midnight, their professional guard would drop. They'd share stories, laugh at a mispronounced word, their knees occasionally bumping under the table. He learned about the time she tried to teach Hamlet to paint with his snout. A messy, colorful failure. And she learned about the crushing loneliness of his first year as CEO. In these moments, the air would grow thick with an unspoken chemistry, a magnetic pull that was becoming impossible to ignore. He would catch himself staring at the way she chewed on her pen when she was thinking, or the way her eyes lit up when she solved a particularly tricky part of the presentation. He felt a desperate urge to close the small distance between them, to see if her lips tasted like the coffee she was constantly drinking. On the final night, after they had rehearsed the presentation to perfection, they were sitting on her floor, leaning against the sofa, surrounded by a fortress of packed terrariums ready for transport. They were both utterly exhausted, but buzzing with a nervous, triumphant energy. I think I'm ready, she said, her voice a soft, tired whisper. I'm still terrified, but I'm ready. You're going to be magnificent, he said, his voice full of a conviction that was absolute. He looked at her, her face soft in the dim light, her eyes heavy-lidded with fatigue. She looked beautiful. She looked real. I couldn't have done it without you, Preston, she said, her gaze meeting his. The playful banter was gone, replaced by a raw, open gratitude. Yes, you could have, he replied honestly. It just would have been harder. I was just a shortcut. No, she said, her voice firm. You weren't a shortcut. You were the reason I believed I could do it at all. The space between them crackled. He could hear his own heartbeat in the silence. This was it. The moment where he should say something. The moment where he should act. But before he could, Hamlet, who had been sleeping soundly, woke up and let out a loud, demanding snort. He trotted over and nudged Laura's hand, reminding them that it was past his bedtime. The moment was broken, the spell shattered by the practical needs of an emotional support pig. Laura laughed, a slightly shaky sound. Right, duty calls. She stood up, stretching her tired limbs. We have an early flight, Preston said, standing as well, his muscles aching. We should get some sleep. They stood at her door, the awkwardness of the unspoken moment hanging between them. Well, she said, her hand on the doorknob. See you in the morning, partner. See you in the morning, Laura, he replied. He walked back to his silent penthouse, his mind a whirlwind. He had spent the last 3 days immersed in her world, and the thought of returning to his own felt like stepping from a vibrant, colorful landscape into a black and white photograph. He knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that this trip to San Francisco was no longer just about her business. It was about theirs. And it wasn't a business trip at all. It was something else entirely. The morning of the flight, the lobby of the Windsor Grand felt like a neutral territory, a stage for a play whose final act was yet to be written. Preston was there first, a picture of calm efficiency, with 2 sleek suitcases and a single, perfectly organized briefcase. He watched the elevator, his stomach churning with an unfamiliar cocktail of nerves and anticipation. When the doors opened, it was not the chaotic, soil-smeared Laura he had first met. It was a woman who looked poised, professional, and ready for battle. She wore a simple but elegant blazer. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her expression was one of fierce determination. Beside her, Hamlet sat patiently in a large, airline-approved pet carrier, looking surprisingly calm about the whole affair. Thomas, the doorman, rushed to help, his face beaming with paternal pride. "Safe travels, Miss Kelly, Mr. Windsor. You go show them what urban roots is made of, miss." "We will, Thomas," Laura said, her voice steady, though Preston could see the tension in her knuckles as she gripped her carry-on bag. Their eyes met over the top of Hamlet's carrier. A silent, electric current passed between them. "Partner." The word echoed in his mind. The journey to the airport in his town car was quiet, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. But the moment they stepped into the bustling terminal, Preston saw the first crack in her armor. Her steps faltered, and a flicker of deep-seated anxiety crossed her face. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low. "Fine," she said, a little too quickly. "Just not a fan of crowds." He knew it was more than that. As they navigated security and made their way to the private lounge he had booked, he watched her carefully. She was a brilliant actress, maintaining a facade of calm, but he saw the subtle signs. The slight tremor in her hands, the way her gaze kept darting toward the large windows overlooking the tarmac. Once they were on the plane, settled into the spacious seats of the first-class cabin, Hamlet safely stowed in the temperature-controlled cargo hold after a tearful, whispered farewell from Laura, her composure finally crumbled. As the engines began to roar to life, she squeezed her eyes shut, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Laura?" he said gently. "I hate this part," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whine of the turbines. "I hate all of it. The takeoff, the landing, the 30,000 feet of nothing in between. It's unnatural." He had never considered that she, a woman who faced down billionaire landlords and built businesses from scratch, could be afraid of anything. The vulnerability was so unexpected, so human, that his heart ached for her. He didn't think, he just acted. He reached over and gently pried one of her hands from the armrest. Her fingers were ice-cold. He wrapped his own, warm hand around hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a slow, soothing rhythm. "It's okay," he said, his voice a low, calming murmur. "It's just physics. Lift, thrust, drag. It's all perfectly logical." "Logic doesn't help when you're in a metal tube hurtling through the sky," she mumbled, but she didn't pull her hand away. In fact, her fingers tightened around his. "Then don't think about the logic," he suggested. "Think about something else. Tell me about the first terrarium you ever made." And so she did. As the plane ascended, she talked. She told him about a small, cracked jam jar she'd found as a child, how she'd filled it with moss and a single, resilient fern from the woods behind her house. She described how she'd watched it every day, a tiny, self-contained world that was all her own. Her voice, initially shaky, grew stronger and more passionate as she lost herself in the memory. He listened. Not just to the words, but to the music of her voice, watching as the fear in her eyes was replaced by the familiar spark of passion. He kept holding her hand, a silent, steady anchor in the turbulent air. An hour into the flight, her voice trailed off. He looked over to find that she had fallen asleep, her head leaning against the plush leather of the seat, her breathing deep and even. Her hand was still wrapped securely in his. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he gently guided her head to rest on his shoulder. She settled there with a soft sigh, her hair tickling his cheek, smelling faintly of coffee and her signature earthy scent. He sat there for the rest of the flight, a living statue, his arm growing numb, his heart full. He watched the clouds drift by, a feeling of profound, undeniable rightness settling over him. He had spent his life avoiding attachments, avoiding the messy, unpredictable world of human emotion. And now, he was willingly, gratefully, acting as a pillow for the very woman who had turned his life upside down. He had never felt more in control. Their arrival in San Francisco was a whirlwind of practiced efficiency. A car was waiting, Their rooms at the city's most exclusive hotel were ready. Preston had booked them a sprawling suite on the top floor, with 2 separate bedrooms connected by a large, elegant living area that boasted a panoramic view of the Golden Gate Bridge. He wanted her to have space, comfort, and a view that would remind her of the scale of her own potential. "Preston, this is," she whispered, standing in the middle of the living room, dwarfed by the floor-to-ceiling windows. "This is more than my entire apartment." "It's a command center," he said, trying to keep his tone professional. "A place to prepare for victory." But as the bellmen brought in their luggage and a relieved, snorting Hamlet, the professional facade melted away. They were just 2 people, a long way from home, on the precipice of something huge. That evening, the night before the presentation, the nervous energy in the suite was palpable. Laura paced the living room, reciting lines from her pitch under her breath. Preston tried to work on his laptop, but found himself unable to concentrate, his eyes constantly drawn to her restless energy. "Enough," he finally said, closing his laptop with a decisive snap. "You know the presentation inside and out. Any more rehearsing will just make you stale. You need a break, we both do." "I can't," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "If I stop, the panic will set in." "Then we won't stop," he said, standing up. "We'll walk. Put on a coat. The air will do you good." She hesitated, then nodded, a look of gratitude on her face. They walked out of the hotel and into the cool, crisp San Francisco night. The air was tinged with the scent of salt and eucalyptus. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, heading toward the waterfront, the distant lights of Alcatraz twinkling in the bay. "I've never seen the Pacific Ocean before," she said quietly, as they stood by a railing, looking out at the dark, churning water. "It's bigger than the Atlantic," he replied, a useless fact that was all his logical brain could offer in the face of such simple, profound beauty. "It feels different," she said, turning to face him. "Wilder, more possible." She hugged her coat closer around her. "Thank you for this, Preston, for everything. The coaching, the flight, this suite, it's too much." "No, it's not," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's the bare minimum that your talent deserves." He paused, gathering his courage. The time for hiding behind business and logistics was over. "Laura, I need you to know. My fee for this, it's not a cup of coffee. My fee is seeing you succeed tomorrow. But my reason for being here, that's something else entirely." She looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his in the dim light of the lamppost. "What is it?" she whispered. He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking until he could feel the warmth radiating from her. "My life, before you and Hamlet showed up, was a perfectly designed, perfectly functioning machine. It was efficient. It was predictable, and it was completely devoid of color. It was black and white." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Her skin was soft, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. "You," he continued, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name, "brought the color. You, with your messy, vibrant, chaotic life. You spilled it all over my perfect, sterile world, and you made it better. You made me better." She opened her eyes, and he saw his own raw emotion reflected there. "Preston," she breathed, her voice trembling. "I'm not here as your consultant, Laura," he said, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. "I'm not here as your logistics manager. I'm here because I can't imagine being anywhere else." And then he closed the small distance that remained between them. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a hesitant, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, a release of weeks of unspoken tension and burgeoning affection. It was firm and soft all at once, a declaration and a discovery. He tasted the salt from the sea air on her lips, and something else, something that was just her. She responded instantly, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, her fingers curling into the soft cashmere of his sweater. It was a kiss that felt like coming home to a place he'd never been before. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. They rested their foreheads together, the city and the ocean and the entire world fading away until there was only the 2 of them, standing together in the cool night air. "So," she whispered, a shaky, brilliant smile on her lips, "what does this make us?" He looked into her eyes, the eyes of the woman who had brought a pig into his perfect building and color into his perfect life, and for the first time the answer was simple. "Partners," he said, "in everything." The morning of the presentation dawned crisp and clear, the California sun glinting off the windows of their suite. The romantic electricity of the previous night still hung in the air, a warm, protective bubble around them. They had talked for hours after that kiss, sharing dreams and fears with an honesty that was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time, Preston hadn't felt the need to project an image of infallible strength. He had simply been Preston, and she had been Laura, and it had been more than enough. Breakfast was a quiet, focused affair. Laura, dressed in a chic forest green pantsuit that radiated quiet confidence, picked at a bowl of fruit, her eyes occasionally flicking to her note cards. Preston, in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, drank his coffee and watched her, his presence a silent, unwavering pillar of support. He didn't offer platitudes or last-minute advice. He had already given her the tools. Now, all he could offer was his belief in her, and he projected it with the intensity of a lighthouse beam. "Ready, partner?" he asked softly, as the car arrived to take them to the Golden Sprout headquarters. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "As I'll ever be," she said, and a small, determined smile touched her lips. "Let's go sell some moss." The Golden Sprout headquarters was a stunning, eco-friendly campus of reclaimed wood and glass, a physical manifestation of their brand. As they were escorted into the boardroom, Preston felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. The room was intimidating. A long, polished oak table surrounded by a dozen executives, their faces sharp, analytical, and radiating an aura of polite skepticism. This was his world, his natural habitat. But today, he was not the predator. He was the support team. He took a seat at the back of the room, giving Laura a small, imperceptible nod. The stage was hers. Laura walked to the front of the room. She placed her laptop on the lectern but didn't open it. She didn't hide behind a screen or a podium. Instead, she stood in the open space, her hands holding a single beautiful terrarium, the one from her apartment, the one she called her storyteller. She began to speak, and she was magnificent. She didn't give a pitch, she told a story. She spoke of the innate human need for nature, the biophilia they had discussed, but she made it personal. She talked about the feeling of cool soil on a hot day, the quiet joy of watching a new leaf unfurl. She held up the terrarium. "We live in a world of concrete and steel," she said, her voice clear and resonant, filling the room with a quiet power Preston had never heard from her before. "We build our lives in boxes, our homes, our offices, our cars. Urban Roots is not about selling plants. It's about putting a little bit of life back in the box. It's a living, breathing piece of art that asks for nothing but a little light and, in return, gives you a daily reminder of peace, growth, and resilience." She was mesmerizing. She was no longer the nervous woman from his living room. She was a visionary, a passionate expert sharing her truth. When she moved on to the business plan, she spoke with the authority he had coached into her, but with the authentic passion that was all her own. She fielded their questions with grace and intelligence, never faltering, never doubting. Preston sat at the back, a silent observer, feeling a pride so immense it was a physical pressure in his chest. He wasn't watching a business presentation. He was watching the woman he was falling in love with command a room of titans, armed with nothing but a glass jar of moss and the unshakable power of her own belief. When she finished, a moment of profound silence hung in the room. Then, the CEO of Golden Sprout, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, began to clap. Slowly, the rest of the board joined in, a wave of genuine, impressed applause. "Miss Kelly," the CEO said, her voice warm with respect. "That was not a proposal. That was a mission statement. We'll see you at the fair tomorrow. Don't disappoint us." The tension broke. Laura's shoulders sagged with relief, a brilliant, teary smile breaking across her face. Her eyes found Preston's across the room, and in that single shared glance, a volume of celebration and gratitude was exchanged. They had done it. The first and highest hurdle was cleared. The next day was the artisan fair. It was held in the flagship Golden Sprout store, a cavernous, beautiful space filled with the scent of organic produce and fresh-baked bread. Their demonstration booth was in a prime location near the entrance. Preston had overseen the setup with the logistical precision of a military general, but the aesthetic was all Laura. It was a miniature oasis of green, with beautifully arranged terrariums, bowls of soft moss for people to touch, and a simple, elegant sign that read, "Urban Roots, a garden in a jar." Laura, dressed in casual jeans and a simple green sweater, looked nervous but excited. "Okay," she said, wringing her hands. "Real people, this is different from a boardroom." "You were brilliant yesterday," he reminded her, adjusting a small fern on the display. "Today is the easy part. Just share your passion. They'll love it." "They?" she asked, looking at him, a mischievous glint in her eye. "You mean we? You're not getting out of this, Mr. Windsor. You're my roadie, remember? You are now officially the Deputy Vice President of Public Moss Engagement." He chuckled. "I'll add it to my resume." The doors opened, and a flood of Saturday shoppers poured in. For the first few hours, Preston stayed in the background, restocking, organizing, and observing. He watched Laura interact with the public, and he was struck again by her natural gift for connection. She didn't sell, she educated. She showed children how to build their own tiny terrariums in plastic cups. She explained to an elderly couple how the closed ecosystem worked. She was a beacon of authentic, joyful energy, and people were drawn to her. Their booth was a hit. A crowd began to form, a stark contrast to the neighboring booth, a slick, corporate-looking display for a high-tech, self-watering planter. The salesman there, a man with an overly toothed smile and a laminated sales pitch, looked on with growing envy. "What's the gimmick here?" the salesman asked Preston during a lull, sidling over to their booth. "Some kind of folksy, back-to-nature thing?" "It's called authenticity," Preston replied, his voice cool and clipped. "You should try it sometime." The man scoffed and retreated to his sterile display. As the afternoon rush hit, Laura was swamped. A line of eager customers snaked from her table. Preston saw the flicker of overwhelm in her eyes. Without a word, he stepped forward, moving from the background to the front line. "Can I help you?" he asked a young woman who was admiring a large, intricate terrarium. She looked at him, then at his expensive watch and perfectly tailored clothes, a hint of surprise on her face. Yeah, I love this one, but I have a terrible track record with plants. They call me the Green Reaper." The old Preston would have had no idea how to respond. But the new Preston, the one who had spent hours listening to Laura, had the answer. "That's the beauty of a closed terrarium," he said, his voice smooth and confident. He picked up the glass vessel. "It creates its own miniature water cycle. You water it once every few months. The plant's resilience does the rest. It's designed for people who appreciate beauty but don't have time for high maintenance. It's self-sufficient." He continued, the words coming easily, naturally. He was speaking her language, channeling her passion. He sold 3 large terrariums in the next 10 minutes. He caught Laura's eye across the crowded table. She was watching him, a look of pure, unadulterated astonishment on her face, mixed with something else, something that made his heart beat faster. They worked together for the rest of the day, a seamless, synchronized team. He would handle the logistical questions, the sales transactions, the hard numbers. She would provide the story, the magic, the human connection. They were 2 halves of a perfect whole. By the end of the day, they had sold every single piece of inventory they had brought. They had a waiting list, 3 pages long. As the last customers drifted away, Laura leaned against the now empty table, her face flushed with exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," she whispered, looking around at the successful devastation of their booth. "You did it," he corrected her gently. "Your vision, your passion." "No," she said, turning to him, her eyes shining. She reached out and took his hand, her dirt-caked fingers lacing with his clean ones. We did it." The CEO of Golden Sprout appeared at their booth, a warm, satisfied smile on her face. "Miss Kelly, Miss—" She looked at Preston, her eyebrows raised in question. "Windsor," he supplied. "Preston Windsor. I'm with the company." The CEO's smile widened. "Well, Mr. Windsor, I've been watching you both all day. You have an incredible product, Miss Kelly. And you," she said, turning to Preston, "are the most overqualified and passionate terrarium salesman I have ever seen. My assistant will be in touch on Monday to finalize the national distribution contract." She shook their hands and walked away, leaving them in a state of stunned, euphoric silence. A national distribution contract. It was done. It was real. Laura let out a whoop of pure joy, throwing her arms around Preston's neck. He caught her, lifting her off the ground and spinning her in a circle, laughing. The exhaustion, the stress, the fear, it all melted away, replaced by a pure, unadulterated happiness that was more intoxicating than any business victory he had ever known. He set her down, but they didn't move apart. Her arms were still around his neck, his hands resting on her waist. The noisy, bustling store faded into a blur. "We should celebrate," he said, his voice low. "Yes," she agreed, her face inches from his. "We should." "I'll book a table at the best restaurant in the city," he began, his old instincts kicking in. "No," she interrupted, her hand coming up to gently touch his cheek. "I have a better idea." She gave him a mischievous, brilliant smile. "Let's go back to the hotel. Order a ridiculous amount of pizza, and you can tell me all about the time you almost acquired a special effects company." He looked at her, at the joy in her eyes, at the woman who had brought color and life and the scent of fresh basil into his world, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no boardroom, no fancy restaurant, no victory in the world that could compare to this. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the best offer I've had all year." The hotel suite, which had once felt like an intimidating corporate command center, now felt like a sanctuary. The panoramic view of the city was no longer just a backdrop for business, it was the glittering witness to their private celebration. 3 large pizza boxes sat open on the marble coffee table, a glorious, greasy monument to their victory. Laura, having traded her blazer for one of the hotel's plush white robes, was curled up on the sofa, a slice of pepperoni pizza in hand, listening with rapt attention. Hamlet, freed from his carrier and happily munching on a curated plate of baby carrots and apple slices, was snoring softly at her feet. "And so, in the end," Preston was saying, leaning back against a pile of pillows on the floor, his tie loosened and his shoes kicked off, "the deal for the special effects company collapsed because their lead animatronic designer insisted on being paid exclusively in vintage pinball machines. It was a logistical nightmare." Laura let out a peal of laughter, a sound that filled the room and made Preston's chest feel warm and light. "You're making that up." "I assure you, I am not," he said with a mock-serious expression. "My life was surprisingly absurd even before I met you in Hamlet." "I don't know," she teased, taking another bite of pizza. "A man who negotiates with pigs for the return of his neckwear seems to have a natural talent for the absurd." He chuckled, a deep, relaxed sound he barely recognized as his own. He looked at her, at the way the soft lamplight caught in her hair, at the smudge of tomato sauce at the corner of her mouth, and he was overwhelmed by a feeling of profound contentment. This, he thought, this is what was missing. Not just color, but this easy, joyful, pizza-fueled peace. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice growing softer, the teasing replaced by a genuine, searching question. He knew she wasn't just asking about the Golden Sprout contract. She was asking about them. About the we that had been born in the San Francisco night. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers over a box of garlic bread. "Now," he said, his voice low and steady, "we build. You have a national brand to launch. Urban Roots is about to become a household name, and I intend to be there for every step of it, as your partner, your consultant, and your chief soil procurement officer. Whatever you need." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of happiness. "And us?" she whispered. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Laura Kelly," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I have spent my entire adult life constructing a world of perfect, predictable order. It was safe, it was successful, and it was profoundly lonely. I had no idea what was missing until you showed up with a pig and a stolen tie and blew it all to pieces. I don't want to go back to the silence. I want to build a new world, with you, if you'll have me." A single happy tear traced a path through the flour smudge she'd somehow acquired. "Yes," she breathed. "Oh, yes, Preston, I'll have you." The return to New York was a mirror image of their departure. On the plane, when the engines began to roar, Laura didn't flinch. She simply reached for his hand, her grip calm and steady, and gave him a brilliant, confident smile. He was her anchor, and she was his. When they walked back into the lobby of the Windsor Grand, it felt different. It was no longer his building. It was their home. Thomas greeted them with a wide, knowing grin. Mrs. Gable, who was passing through, stopped to pat Hamlet on the head and offer Laura her personal bought secret recipe for a fertilizer tea. The fortress had become a village. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of happy, productive chaos. Laura's apartment was officially converted into the Urban Roots headquarters, with Preston's penthouse serving as the executive boardroom. He helped her navigate the complexities of the Golden Sprout contract, his sharp legal and financial acumen, a perfect complement to her creative vision. He never once tried to take over. He listened, he advised, and he supported, watching with immense pride as she confidently took the helm of her rapidly expanding empire. His own life was irrevocably changed. His sterile penthouse was now frequently filled with the scent of fresh soil and the sound of Laura's laughter. Hamlet had a permanent plush rug in the corner of his living room and had discovered a deep and abiding passion for watching the financial news network, snorting with what seemed like insightful commentary at the market fluctuations. One evening, about a month after their return, Preston was standing on his balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Laura came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head on his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "I was thinking about rules," he said, turning in her arms to face her. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. "And how some of them are meant to be broken." He took her hand and led her to the elevator. He didn't say where they were going. He simply pressed the button for the lobby. They rode down in comfortable silence. In the center of the grand marble lobby, on the large formal bulletin board where official notices were usually posted, a single new document was displayed in a heavy glass frame. The old Rule 1, Section 1, Clause A had been removed. Laura stepped closer to read the new plaque. Her eyes scanned the elegant formal script. The Windsor Grand Residency Agreement. Addendum 1, Section 1, Clause A. It is the official policy of this establishment that a home is not merely a place of residence, but a space for life, joy, and companionship. As such, residents are permitted, and indeed encouraged, to share their homes with the companions that bring them happiness, be they furry, feathered, or otherwise. All species are welcome. Signed, Preston Windsor, owner. Laura slowly turned to look at him, her eyes shining with a love and understanding that was so profound it took his breath away. It was more than just a change in building policy. It was a public declaration. It was his unconditional surrender. It was the ultimate testament to his transformation. A final, definitive statement that the old Preston Windsor was gone, replaced by a man who had learned that true order wasn't about the absence of chaos, but about embracing the beautiful, messy, wonderful chaos of a life filled with love. "You did this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We did this," he corrected her gently. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. "I believe in rules, Laura. But I believe they should be the right ones, and I want to make some new ones with you." He got down on one knee, right there in the middle of the lobby, under the watchful, smiling eyes of Thomas the doorman. He opened the box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, but instead of a diamond, it held a single, perfectly cut, leaf-green emerald. "Laura Kelly," he said, his voice shaking ever so slightly, "you are the most brilliantly chaotic, wonderfully alive person I have ever known. You have taken my sterile black and white world and painted it in colors I never knew existed. I love you. Will you marry me? Will you and Hamlet agree to a permanent, legally binding merger?" Tears were streaming freely down her face now, but she was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," she cried. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. He stood up and she launched herself into his arms, kissing him with a fierce, happy passion, right there in the middle of their home. Later that night, they were back on her balcony, which was now a lush, overflowing jungle of herbs, flowers, and tomato plants. They stood looking out at the glittering city, his arms wrapped around her, her new ring catching the moonlight. Hamlet was sleeping soundly inside, his work as a porcine Cupid finally complete. "You know," she said, leaning her head against his chest, "I still have your tie." He chuckled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I know. I was thinking of having it framed, as a reminder of our unconventional beginning." "I have a better idea," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. He looked from the thriving garden on her balcony to the sleek, orderly lines of his own, one floor above. "I was thinking of installing a spiral staircase." She looked up at him, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. She understood completely. It wasn't about her moving up or him moving down. It was about joining their two worlds, their two homes, their two lives, into one. A perfect, seamless fusion of order and chaos. "A spiral staircase," she repeated, tasting the words. "I like that. Lots of room for trailing ivy." He held her tighter, breathing in the scent of her hair, the rich soil, and the sweet promise of their future. He looked out at the vast, sprawling city, a world of infinite possibilities. His perfect building no longer had a rule against pets. His perfectly ordered life no longer had a rule against love. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he had finally found the one rule worth living by. Theirs. What did you think of the story of Preston and Laura? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey from the hallway to the spiral staircase? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for everyone who has stayed with us until the very end, who believes that the best things in life, love, growth, and the occasional emotional support pig, are worth making a little mess for, please comment new rules. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will change the world.